Welcome to Biblical Foundations, a podcast of the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm your co-host, Jimmy Rowe, along with Dr. Andreas Kostenberger. Join us as we discuss issues in biblical scholarship for the church. As you know, Richard Bauckham has written a very influential work on the Gospels, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. For our listeners who are maybe not as familiar with Baukham's work, he stresses the character of the Gospels as eyewitness testimony. At the same time, if I remember correctly, Bauckham doesn't hold to Matthean or Joannian authorship. How would you position yourself in this regard, and what are we to make of the fact that the Gospels don't provide a description of Jesus' physical appearance or much information about his early years, his childhood? In what ways are these omissions typical or untypical for ancient biographies?
Ancient biographies usually do have something about the early years. They don't always have a lot. Sometimes I think it depended on how much the biographer knew about the early years. But sometimes also it has to do with what they wanted to focus on, what was most important. Of course, Matthew and Luke have infancy narratives. John, as I said a few moments ago, he goes way back to the beginning, in the beginning, and echoing the Old Testament. And then Mark, I think, also implies something that goes back before, because he, immediately speaks at the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But then he immediately, in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 1, quotes scripture about one who's come to prepare the way of the Lord, and goes on to speak of John preparing the way of the Lord, and Jesus therefore being the Lord, the one who's prophesied. So he's actually going back before the birth as well to, in a sense, a more important origin in terms of the mission of the way of the Lord. Now, in terms of physical description, that often occurs in ancient biographies, but by no means does it always occur in ancient biographies. So that's not specifically necessary for the focus. Richard Bauckham and I, we agree with each other's points. We're doing something different. He's emphasizing that he's not saying that eyewitnesses wrote all the Gospels, and of course none of us would say that Mark or Luke were eyewitnesses, or almost none of us would say that Mark or Luke were eyewitnesses. But Richard is saying it goes back to eyewitnesses. It has the character of eyewitness material, and I agree with that. My approach is to say, well, what would we expect from ancient biographies that were from within living memory? In terms of overlap with what Richard is doing, it would be to say, well, normally when ancient historians or biographers were writing within living memory, they would try to get access to the eyewitness sources, whether written or oral. But mine is dealing more with the genre than with that. Now, in terms of the authorship, actually, and Andreas and I are among the minority of scholars in the wider guild, those who are read outside of evangelicals, but we're among the minority who argue that. Well, actually, I don't think we're among the minority who argue that John was an eyewitness. I think we're just among the minority who argue that John was John. But yeah, we have in that Andreas and I would differ from Richard Bauckham, although he does think that John was an eyewitness. He just thinks it was a different John, not John the Apostle.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now, Craig, one thing that I'm intrigued by is, you generally talk more broadly about, the genre of the Gospels, even though, of course, you have specific treatments of each and every one of them. But are there any maybe minor or degrees of difference in genre between Matthew, Mark, and Luke individually, and then also between them and John on the other? And I know you cover this in your book, but for example, you call Luke a biohistory and an apologetic historiography. In my work on John's Gospel, also, I found that John has certain dramatic qualities, and there's some literature on that. John is drama that is not as evident in the other Gospels. So could you maybe briefly comment on that, and our listeners, they just so they know, you generally presuppose Markan priority and what's called the two-source hypothesis in your book. I agree with that, which is the majority consensus view, which is that Mark was the first to write his gospel, and subsequently both Matthew and Luke drew on Mark as one of their sources, and as you mentioned, at least one other likely shared source. So the question is, what about any genre differences, all within the overall genre of biography between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John?
Yeah, when we speak of ancient biography, obviously not all ancient biographies were exactly the same. So they use historical events, but there are differences among them. So there's kind of a range of what they did with their events, how they articulate them, and a range in terms of their focus. So most biographies did care about making what Roman rhetoricians would call exempla, that is, moral examples that could be used to draw lessons from. Historians did the same thing, and often they talk about this in their writings. So you could learn practical things from biographic material, lessons in terms of how to behave or how not to behave, lessons in terms of what to do politically or militarily or not, and also often they would have theological lessons, or at least theological assumptions, and we see that in Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Dio Cassius, certainly in Josephus, and of course we see it in the Old Testament historians. And so it's no surprise that we have those kind of emphases in the Gospels as well. Now, in terms of their focus, I think because you have Luke, Acts together as 2 volumes of one work, sometimes what you would have in antiquity, you would have a multi-volume history, but within that multi-volume history, you would have a particular volume that would be a biography of a particular figure. So when we take Luke, Acts together, I think we can see it as a history or historical monograph. But when we take Luke by itself, it's biography. So it's a biographic component within a larger history. Those genres overlapped enough that I don't really see that as problematic. John, yeah, I think you put it well in terms of the dramatic way that he depicts things. And I have to admit, I did this, I guess, 1,600-page commentary on John, and I do not have everything figured out on John. I'm still working on that. But
Same here.
So I have a lot to learn from you and from Paul Anderson and other. Paul is another one of us who thinks that John the Apostle is the author. But I'm still trying to figure out how it all fits together, but just intrigued by it very much.
In chapter 4, you speak of Jesus as being more but not less than a sage. And so maybe you can explain a bit more. Isn't sage more of a Greco-Roman philosophical designation, while the Gospels present Jesus as more but not less than a Jewish rabbi? Actually, later in your book, you have an entire chapter 15, entitled Jesus was a Teacher. Can you elaborate on this?
By sage, I'm just using that as a broader rubric for a teacher, whether it's a philosopher or a rabbi. Rabbi can hold some more particular connotations, just like philosopher does. When you have like Sirach, or the son of Sirach, sage kind of fits him. Rabbi, that designation as a title probably didn't exist yet at the time that Sirach wrote. And so situating Jesus in terms of Jewish teachers somewhere between Sirach in the pre-Christian era and what became the rabbinic movement. Often Jewish teachers told parables. They often spoke graphic sayings that would grab your attention, often using hyperbole or rhetorical overstatement. A number of ways that Jesus was characteristic of Jewish sages. At the same time, I make that comparison partly because of biographies of sages. That was a particular kind of biography where people would collect the sayings of their teachers, the behavior of their teachers. Greeks tended to do that in a way that we don't have for the later rabbis. But again, if you're writing in the diaspora and you're using biography as a genre, if you were writing about a rabbi, then you could use that kind of genre. But Jesus is not just a sage. Normally, the Jerusalem elite wouldn't bother to seek the execution of just a sage who wasn't really causing too much trouble in public. I mean, Jesus overturns the tables. Right. Jesus has a massive following, especially in Galilee. So Jesus is also a public figure. And of course, and I dealt with this more in the historical Jesus of the Gospels, but the Gospels consistently portray Jesus not just as a teacher, obviously, but as more than a teacher, as a prophet and more than a prophet, ultimately as Messiah, as Son of God, and so forth. And that's consistent in all of our earliest material about Jesus. But in terms of what we have of ancient biographies in general in this period, we do have biographies of sages. We do have biographies of public figures. And taken together, it gives us ways that we can make some analogies for understanding the character of the Gospels.
That's great. Yes. And just returning, one more time to the literary genre of gospel, later in your book, you point out that that some distance from the events is often helpful when writing biography, but not too much distance, because then the connection between the person writing the biography and his subjects may become more tenuous and remote. You say on page 257 that the generation likeliest to supply the most useful memory of a person by ancient standards might be the generation just after the person's death. So just, I think it's fascinating. Are you meaning to imply that eyewitnesses themselves typically didn't write biographies, but rather served as sources for the next generation who did, or do you mean something different by that?
Eyewitnesses could write biographies. I mean, we do have some examples of that, and of course, I think John is an example of it.
Right.
Yeah,
would be an example.
But often, teachers, for example, or sages, left the matter of publication to their disciples, but sometimes it could be disciples of the disciples, or most people didn't actually. Most literate people and most educated people didn't actually do the writing themselves; they dictated it. So sometimes people talk about, the disciples were illiterate. And I don't think could be true of Matthew if he was a tax collector, but even if the disciples were illiterate, you didn't have to be illiterate to dictate, and you didn't, certainly if you're leading a movement, you're going to have people within the movement who are literate. You're going to have people within the movement who are able to compose on the level of the Gospels, for sure.
Sure.
And in the case of Um, Remind me again of that. I go off on tangents and then I forget where I'm at.
No, I think the idea what you said that John may be the case of an eyewitness who actually himself wrote a biography might in part I think be accounted for by his unusually long
Yes.
lifespan, right? That he in his case he simply was able to still tackle the task himself rather than handing it off to his disciples after his death. I wonder, if that maybe accounts for Richard Bauckham's reluctance to attribute, that kind of trajectory to attribute the writing of say Matthew and John to Matthew and John themselves because of what you articulated maybe as a typical premise that he would often be the followers of a teacher after their the person's death, but as you mentioned, it's
Now,
not absolute.
Xenophon,
So
in what we sometimes call protobiography, he wrote about Agesilaus. I believe Cornelius Nepos also wrote about somebody that he was friends with. I actually had a student write a dissertation. Edward Wright wrote or Edward T. Wright, sorry, wrote a dissertation about different figures in antiquity who wrote biographies of people that they knew, and then used that as a comparison for John, the beloved disciple, writing about Jesus. In terms of writing during the events, often ancient historians thought that was too close. One reason had to do with political exigencies. Like I mentioned earlier, Nicolaus of Damascus writing about Augustus. Well, you better only write nice things if you're writing during the time of the emperor.
Yep.
And we see that, for example, with one historian called Velleius Paterculus. When he's writing, the head of the Praetorian Guard at that point was Sejanus or Sejanus, who was really close to the Emperor Tiberius. And anybody that got in trouble with Sejanus got executed. So, obviously you're going to write nice things about Sejanus, and Velleius Paterculus did. Tacitus is writing a little bit later, and we get all the dirt on Sejanus. He didn't come out very nicely afterwards. Having some historical perspective also shows you see where events lead. You see the outcomes of events, and so you see what's more significant in the longer run. Of course, what we're most concerned about and what the Gospels are most concerned about is what matters most in the long run of eternity. But even in terms of, just a generation later, the Encyclopedia Britannica article on Adolf Hitler, before Hitler went very far, talks more about him being a vegetarian than it talks about his it's more concerned with his diet than with his plan to eradicate non-Aryans and so on. Obviously, after World War II, the article was more substantive. And so some historical distance is helpful, but at the same time, you want to keep the living connection in terms of people who actually knew the eyewitnesses, or at the least, or depending on sources for that. Papias, writing in, I think, the very early 2nd century, talks about hearing about these reports about the apostles from those who heard them, and he speaks of hearing from John the Elder. But I think, and I think Andreas, you and I both hold this, that he means the same John that he's just referred to among the apostles who also were elders, namely John the apostle. And I think that Eusebius separated that mainly because he didn't like the book of Revelation. But anyway.
Yeah. And obviously, again, John had such a long lifespan that even though he still most likely wrote the gospel, he still would have had that distance, probably, more so than, say, Mark or others.
Yeah.
Well, you also speak of the historical intention of the gospel writers. On page 67, you say that while we may recognize the evangelist's emphases and question them on matters of detail, we ultimately have little to work with for alternative reconstructions if we dismiss the gospel materials. And you insist that we should consider the gospels themselves as evidence rather than saying, other than the New Testament gospels, we have no evidence, and implying that we have no evidence when we actually have the
Yeah.
gospels. What are the implications then from your work when interacting with maybe more skeptical scholars? For example, Bart Ehrman, who alleges that the gospels are riddled with inaccuracies and contradictions. Of course, as you mentioned in your book, Ehrman believed Jesus existed, but he thinks the Gospels writers frequently contradict one another in their accounts.
Yeah. The gospel writers, some of the things he sees as contradictions, I see as complementary perspectives or complementary information.
Exactly.
But so I mean, there are differences there, but the differences don't have to amount to contradictions. In terms of the nature of ancient biography, we should expect it, especially when it's within living memory. We should expect it to be historically based. I mean, that was the nature of the genre. That's what we find. Like if you compare Suetonius's works on somebody within living memory, like the Emperor Otho, with what Tacitus writes about Otho in his histories, and what Plutarch writes about Otho in his biographies, you compare those. I made a chart just comparing.
Yes, very helpful in 3 parallel columns.
The same as we often do with the Gospels, and it's like clearly they're not trying to make up things. This is an information-based genre. It's very, very unlike novels, and it's not just legends that grew over centuries of time. I mean, that old model of at least certain kinds of form criticism that grew out of studies of Russian and German folk tales that have been passed on for centuries. And first of all, the Gospels as recent biographies are not comparable to folk tales. They're trying to depend on information that they consider actual information about a recent historical character. And secondly, this isn't information that's been passed on for centuries. This is recent information. And even in studies of oral tradition, they distinguish between oral history, the period when there's still living memory of the person, and oral tradition. But even with oral tradition, you have condensing it into certain points, but you normally expect, even with oral tradition, that there's a historical basis to it. But with the Gospels, we're not even talking about oral tradition. We're talking about oral history, the earlier period of that. So I can also illustrate this in terms of, and this is comparable to what Richard Bauckham says about the Gospels as testimony, the Jesus of testimony. When I was working on my earlier historical Jesus of the Gospels, I was trying to only argue from the critical minimum that scholars normally used. So not saying that's all I believed, but there's a danger of trying to, when we're dialoguing with people and we're saying, okay, here's something we all agree on. Let's build on this. Let's see where this can lead us. That can be useful for dialogue, but if you get in the habit of thinking that way, I got in the habit of thinking that way while I was working on that book, and sometimes my wife would say something to me, and I would respond without thinking, can you give me evidence for that assertion? Well, my wife's PhD is in history, and she made a very important point after that, which basically is, look, if you have the testimony of a credible eyewitness, that is itself evidence. So, if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are normally correct where we can test them, chances are, we should accept their testimony and everything else too, unless we have good reason to do otherwise. And of course, again, as those of us who believe it's inspired have really good reason to go even beyond that. But in terms of trusting what the Gospels say, but I learned my lesson.
Yeah, it you talking about the old paradigm, basing the Gospels research on folklore studies. It kind of makes me think back to when I grew up as a boy in Austria, and I would hear Hansel and Gretel and some of the other fairy tales, and clearly I think most of us would agree that the Gospels are rather different in genre. Well, Craig, I know we've only scratched the surface in our discussion of the gospel genre and of your book today. I'd certainly recommend that those among our listeners who are further interested in the subject actually get Dr. Keener's book and read it in its entirety. We haven't even touched on other important subjects you discuss in your book, such as literary conventions in ancient biographies or memory studies, part 5, and the light they shed on the genre of the Gospels. I feel like the author of Hebrews who says, we've run out of time here. But as we conclude, I mentioned at the outset of our podcast that your book is only a prolegomenon, a preliminary study in a way to the question of the actual historical reliability of the Gospels, though it's very important, and you do give plenty of examples. So I wonder, is there any possibility you might write a sequel to Christobiography where you actually do address the historical reliability of the Gospels directly based on your preliminary work in this volume?
I have been itching to get back to Paul and write more like I did with the Mind of the Spirit and so on. But
right.
And I did do some in the historical Jesus of the Gospels and in my Matthew commentary, my John commentary. But I was thinking I was going to be getting back to Paul, but then I was asked for the ICC series to do a commentary on Mark, and I figured this is just such a great opportunity. So I'm going to be doing that. That's going to probably tie me up for the next few years, and so I'll be able to explore that to some degree. Again, I'm going to be writing it on the scholarly level. So I'm going to be there's certain epistemological presuppositions that I personally hold that I'm not going to be able to articulate explicitly in the book. I'll have to deal more with the more widely held epistemological presuppositions. But there's so much there. I mean, just being able to work from Mark being an ancient biography and what was expected of ancient biographies, that just shifts the default setting in such a way that it enables me to start with the premise that these reports are reports that, well, and also I think that I do take very seriously Papias's report that Mark got this from Peter. So I think it ultimately does go back to an eyewitness. So I'm glad I'll be able to do that with what I think is the first gospel, because that sets kind of a pattern for the gospels that follow. I mean, now I think if I were writing on Matthew, I'd be able to do a lot more. If I were writing on John now, I'd be able to do a lot more. But I'm almost 60, so I figure I better number my days carefully.
Well, Dr. Keener, I want to thank you for joining us today and taking time to share about your work with us. We're very grateful for your outstanding work and pray for many more years of fruitful ministry.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be with you.
Thank you for joining us today at Biblical Foundations. For more information, please visit the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern at cbs.mbts.edu. For further resources, please also visit biblicalfoundations.org. Please join us again next time at the Biblical Foundations Podcast.